There is a particular sound a person makes when they have decided to die rather than be taken. It is not a scream. It is quieter than that, a long, steady breath, the kind you take before lifting something too heavy for you. I heard that breath in the dark of a cattle car somewhere east of the Chiricahuas, over the stamp and shift of 40 steers, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to unhear it. I did not go looking for her. I want that understood. I was a man who moved cows for money and kept my head down and wrote names in a little book so I would not forget the people I had failed, and by that spring the book was mostly full. I thought there was no room left in me for one more. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a great many things that week, about what a person can survive, about what mercy costs, about whether a man like me had any right to offer it. But the first thing I was wrong about was the simplest. I thought the sound in the dark was an animal. It was a woman, and she had already made up her mind. The train was called the Sonora Belle, though there was nothing bell about it. 9 stock cars, a cattle chute's worth of stink, and a caboose where I was supposed to sleep and mostly didn't. We'd loaded at Bowie and were bound for the yards at Deming, and then, God and the Southern Pacific willing, points east where beef became money and money became somebody else's problem. I was 31 years old and I had been driving cattle on hoof and on rail for more than half of that. My hands had gone to leather. My name was Elias Rourke, though nobody used it because there was nobody around to use it. I want to tell you about the book before I tell you about her, because you won't understand what I did unless you understand the book. It was a stationer's pocket ledger, the kind a shopkeeper uses to tally accounts, but I didn't keep accounts in it. I kept names. When a man died in front of me and I could have moved faster, spoken sooner, been braver, I wrote his name down that night so I would carry him. There was Tom Fielding, who drowned in the Pecos while I stood on the bank calculating whether the current was worth it, and decided it wasn't, and was right, and hated myself anyway. There was a boy named Sixto whose horse rolled on him in a wash. There were 11 others, and near the middle of the book, in handwriting worse than the rest because my hand had been shaking, there were 4 names I never spoke aloud, from a morning near Sibque when I was scouting for men in blue and did nothing while things were done that no amount of doing nothing could ever make me clean of. Apache names, those 4, spelled the way they had sounded to my clumsy ear, which is to say spelled wrong, which is to say I had failed them twice, once in the doing and once in the remembering. That is the man I was on the night I heard the breathing. A man with a book full of the dead, riding a stink train through the dark, thumbing the pages by lantern light and wondering if there was a God small enough to care about the accounting of a nobody. I'd gone forward to check the 3rd car because a steer had been bawling wrong, that low, snagged note that means an animal's caught a leg or gone down and is about to be trampled. You lose a steer to a broken leg, that's dollars, and dollars were the whole reason a man like me existed. So I swung along the running board with the desert going by black and enormous, and I hauled the slat door back a hand's width, and I put my lantern up to the gap. Cattle, 40 pairs of dull, wet eyes catching the light. The heat of them rolled out at me, and the smell, and under the smell something that didn't belong, wood smoke and creosote bush, and a thin thread of human sweat that was different from mine. And in the far corner, wedged between the flank of a big brindle steer and the plank wall, low to the fouled straw where no man would think to look because no man would climb in there among 1,000 pounds of nervous beef, a shape, folded small, a dark head bent to dark knees. Breathing, that long, steady, deciding breath. I have thought since that if the steer hadn't shifted right then, letting the lantern light fall past its shoulder, I'd have shut the door and moved on and lived a smaller, easier life. But the steer shifted, and the light fell, and she lifted her head. I'd like to tell you I saw courage first, or defiance, or something a storybook would want. What I saw first was exhaustion. She had the face of someone who had not slept in the way sleep is supposed to work in a long, long time, not just tired but worn through, the way a saddle worn through shows the tree underneath. She was maybe 25, maybe less. Hunger makes it hard to tell. Chiricahua I'd have guessed from the cut of her, though I want to be careful here, because guessing was one of the great sins of my time, and I did enough of it. A wool trade blanket over a torn calico dress that had belonged to some other woman first. Bare feet, cut and dark with dried blood. And her eyes on mine, holding, not blinking, the way you'd hold a knife you couldn't afford to drop. We looked at each other for what felt like the length of a psalm. Then her hand moved, slow, so I'd see it, which was a kindness I didn't deserve and didn't understand yet. And she drew back the corner of the blanket, and I thought, she's got a weapon, and my own hand went to my hip out of pure animal habit. She didn't have a weapon. She had a length of rope. Good rope, braided, the kind we used for the door latches, and she had it looped and knotted in a way that a man who has thrown a lot of loops recognizes at once, and she had the loose end already up over the iron cross brace above her, where the car's frame met the roof. I understood then what the breathing was for. "Don't," I said. My voice came out wrong, cracked too loud. Two of the steers startled and lurched, and she pressed flat against the wall to keep from being crushed. And even then, even with half a ton of animal knocking against her, she did not take her eyes off me, and she did not let go of the rope. She said something. Not to me, I don't think. In her own tongue, low, and though I didn't have the words, I had the shape of them, because I'd heard that shape before on a cold morning near Sibque, and it is the shape a person's voice makes when they are speaking to the dead they expect to see soon. "No," I said again, and I said it in the little Spanish I had, because Spanish was the trade tongue and I was grasping. "Espera, por favor, wait." Her head tipped just slightly, so she had some Spanish. It was the first thing that passed between us that wasn't fear. "No me toque," she said, "don't touch me." Her voice was ruined, hoarse from thirst, I'd learn, and from other things. "No me leave, don't take me." And there it was, the whole situation, in 3 words. She thought I was going to take her. Back or in, or wherever it was she was fleeing, that was so much worse than a rope over a beam. And why wouldn't she think that? Every man who looked like me that she had ever met had been in the business of taking. Now, I need you to understand the position I was in, because I've told this story to exactly 2 people in my life, and both of them looked at me like the answer was easy. And it was not easy, and I won't pretend it was. I was a hired man. There were, at that time, a certain number of Apache who had left the reservation at San Carlos, or been marked to leave it, sent east, some of them in boxcars not so different from this one, to fever country in Florida and Alabama, where the ones I'd known who went did not come back. And there was money. There was always money for a returned Apache, alive or otherwise, and the Southern Pacific did not love finding stowaways in its stock. And the men who rode these lines, the brakemen, the yard bulls, the 2 soldiers I knew for a fact were dead-heading in the caboose behind mine because they'd bummed my coffee at Bowie. Those men would not see a frightened woman worn through to the tree. They would see money or trouble or sport, and I had watched enough of my life to know which. If I raised my voice, she was theirs. If I climbed in, she'd use the rope before I crossed the car. If I shut the door and walked away, I'd have my wage and my quiet caboose and 1 more page in the book, and I'd have to add her without even a name. I looked at her, and she looked at me, and between us 40 steers swayed with the swaying of the train, and I made the first of the several decisions that this story is really about. I set the lantern down on the running board where its light would keep, and I let go of the door, and I sat down on my heels in the gap so that my head was below hers. Lower than her, you understand, so that she was looking down at me and not up, and I took off my hat. I don't fully know why I did that. It wasn't calculated. Something in me said, make yourself small, and I did. "I'm not going to take you anywhere," I said, slow. English now because I was out of Spanish and because it didn't matter. She'd read the rest off my hands, off my lowered head, the way you read a horse. "I'm not going to touch you. I'm going to sit right here. And I'd take it kindly if you'd take that rope down because it's a good rope and I'll be wanting it for the latches." That last part was a fool thing to say. I don't know where it came from, but something crossed her face, not a smile, God no, nothing so warm as that, but a flicker. The rope was for the latches. Something in her, some part that had gone somewhere far off to prepare for dying, took a half step back toward the world at the ridiculousness of a man worrying about his latch rope, while she stood with the noose half made. She didn't take it down, but she didn't finish it either. Her hand stayed on the loose end up by the beam, and she watched me, and the train ran on through the dark, and for a long time that was all there was. Me on my heels with my hat in my hands, her in the corner with the rope in hers, and the steers between us breathing their sweet grass and dung breath into the cold air coming off the desert. I started to talk. I don't know that I'd ever talked so much in my life. I told her nonsense, mostly, the names of the steers, which I made up as I went, because a man who names cattle is a man too foolish to be dangerous. I told her we were bound for Deming and then east, and I watched the word east land on her like a blow, and I understood, then, that east was the exact thing she was fleeing. That somewhere east was where they'd sent whoever she had left. and that she got herself onto this train not to go there, but because it was going away from something worse, and that she had not yet worked out the terrible arithmetic that away and toward were, on a rail line, the same direction. I told her about the water in my canteen. I unhooked it slow, and I set it down in the straw, in the middle distance, in the no-man's land between us, and I pushed it toward her with the toe of my boot as far as it would go, and then I drew back. She looked at the canteen for a long time. I understood that too. To reach for it, she'd have to come out of the corner, cross open ground, put herself within a man's arm length. The whole history of her body was telling her the canteen was a trap. She was so thirsty her lips had cracked and bled and dried and cracked again. And still she waited and calculated and did not reach. I have carried a lot of shame in my life. But I want to tell you that watching a human being do that arithmetic, thirst against safety, the water she needed against the men who'd made her afraid of water offered by a hand, remembering that, I have never once in the years since been able to make myself feel that the men of my time and place, myself among them, were the civilized ones. We taught her that. Some of us with our hands and the rest of us with our silence, and I was a silence man, and my book was full. She reached. Fast a strike, not a reach, out and back. The canteen snatched into the corner in one motion. She drank with her eyes on me the whole time, choking a little in her haste, water running down her chin, and it was the least dignified and most dignified thing I ever saw, and I looked away out of respect, out at the black desert, and gave her that. When I looked back, the canteen was empty, and her hand was down from the beam. The rope hung there, still knotted, still ready, but her hand was down. There, I said, quiet. That's better, that's. That was when I heard the boots on the running board behind me. 2 sets, coming forward from the caboose, careless, loud, the way men walk when they own a place. And a voice I knew, Corporal Deal, one of the 2 soldiers who'd bummed my coffee, a big soft-handed man with a mean streak he wore like a good coat, calling out over the wind. "Rourke, that your lantern? Rourke, you got a cow down or what?" And a beam of light, he had a lantern of his own, came swinging up the side of the car, toward the open gap, toward me on my heels, toward the woman in the corner with the empty canteen and the rope above her, and nowhere, nowhere at all to go. I had about the length of one breath to decide the rest of both our lives. I stood up, I put myself in the gap. I put my body in the light so that Deal's beam hit my back and stopped there, and I pulled the slat door most of the way shut behind me with one hand, casual, like a man closing up after a look. And I turned around with my face arranged into the bored, put-upon expression of a hired man who has been up too long. "Steer's caught a leg," I called back. "Nothing you'd want to see up close. It's about to void itself all down." "God," said Deal, and stopped where he was and lowered the lantern, because there is no man alive who wants to help with a down steer at 2 in the morning. "Well, you need a hand." "I need about 4 hands and a winch," I said. "You got those in the caboose." He laughed, his partner laughed, they turned around. And in the half-shut dark behind me, so quiet I felt it more than heard it, a woman who had spent the last hour deciding to die let out a breath that, for the first time, was not the long, steady, deciding kind. It was just a breath, just the ordinary breath of the living. I want to tell you I felt like a hero. I didn't. I felt like a man who had just told his first lie in a series of lies that were going to get very much larger, and I felt the weight of every name in my book, and I understood, standing on that running board with the desert huge and cold around me, that I had just made myself responsible for a life, and that I had no earthly idea how to keep it. I slid the door open behind me, just wide enough, and I climbed down into the straw and the steers and the smell, into the dark with her, and I pulled it shut, and it was the first time in my whole cattle-driving life I had ever shut myself inside the thing I was supposed to be guarding from the outside. She was pressed to the corner still, but her hand did not go up to the rope. She looked at me and I looked at her, and neither of us had the words for what had just happened, so we didn't try to find them. I sat down in the straw with my back to the door as far from her as the car allowed, and I put my hat on my knee, and I said the only true thing I had. "They're not getting you," I said. "Not while I'm on this train, I don't know how yet. But not while I'm on this train." She didn't answer. Outside, the desert turned. Somewhere behind us, Deal and his partner were laughing about the down steer that didn't exist. And in the dark, after a while, so soft I nearly missed it, she said one word back to me in English, the only English word she'd give me for 2 more days, and the word was, Why? Not a question. She didn't say it like a question. She said it like an accusation, like a bill come due, like the last name in a book she couldn't read but somehow knew I was carrying. Why? I opened my mouth to answer her, and I found I did not have one. Here is a thing about hiding a person on a moving train. The train does not care. It keeps its schedule. It stops where it stops, for water and for coal and for men in uniforms to walk its length with lanterns. And every one of those stops was a small death that the two of us had to die together and survive together. And by the third stop, we had learned to do it without speaking, which is a kind of intimacy I had never had with another living soul and have never had since. I didn't answer her why that first night. I couldn't. Instead, I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was work, and the work saved us both from having to talk. I got the down-steer story to hold. Come first light, I made a show of it, dragged the brindle around, mudded up some straw, so that when the brakeman looked and he saw a big animal favoring a leg and a tired cowhand tending it, and he grunted and moved on. She had gone flat under the trade blanket in the corner, under a heap of straw I'd banked over her, and a man would have had to climb in and dig to find her, and no man climbs into a stock car full of nervous beef to dig in the straw. That was the whole of our plan, and it was a bad plan, and it worked because bad plans work more often than anybody wants to admit. Between stops, we lived. I brought her food from my own stores, jerked beef, hard biscuit, dried apple I'd been saving. I brought her water 2 canteens at a time and turned my back while she drank. I found her a pair of my spare socks and a piece of trade cloth for her feet, and I want to tell you about her feet, because her feet told me the rest of the story before her mouth ever did. They were cut to ribbons. Not from the train. Older than the train, a week of walking at least over the kind of country that eats boots, and she'd had no boots. And the cuts had a pattern to them, the outside edges worst, that a man who has tracked knows means running. Running flat out in the dark, in terrain you can't see, when you're past caring what the ground does to you because the thing behind you is worse than the ground. I cleaned them the second night. I asked first, held up the cloth and the canteen and made the motion and waited, and she watched me the way she watched everything, weighing it, and then she put her foot out into the light. That was the largest thing she had given me yet, larger than the why, and I knew it, and I was careful, and I did not talk while I did it. I've gentled a lot of frightened animals in my time, and the first rule is you don't chatter at them to comfort yourself. So I worked in silence, and she watched, and when I'd wrapped the worst of it, she drew her foot back and said, in Spanish, low, "You did this before." "Horses," I said, "not people." Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not a smile, but its cousin. "Same," she said, "igual." And that was the first joke between us, if you could call it that, and I laughed, and she didn't. But she watched me laugh with something in her face that wasn't fear for the first time, and I remember thinking it clear as a bell over the rattle of the wheels, I would do a great deal to see that woman actually laugh. I never did. I want to be honest about the shape of this. But I thought it that night, and thinking it changed me. Her story came in pieces over 2 days in the Spanish we shared, and the hand signs we invented, and the long silences that said more than either. I won't pretend I got all of it or got it right, but here is what I understood. She had been at San Carlos. Her people, a brother and aunt, 2 small ones who I gathered were her brother's children, had been on the list. You understand what the list was. The list was for the train east, the other train, the one that went to the fever country, and everyone who went on that list understood that it was, for most, a one-way accounting. Her brother had told her to go before the list came for her, too. There'd been a night and men and a fence and a run, and here her hands stopped signing and went still in her lap, and she looked at the wall of the car, and I did not ask what the stillness was for, because I had a book full of stillnesses of my own, and I knew you don't ask. The little ones, the 2 small ones. I gathered from a gesture, from the way her hand dropped, from a single word she said and then would not say again, that she had not been able to bring them. That there'd been a choice in the dark at the fence, and she'd had to make it fast, and she'd made it the way a person makes it when there is no good way, and she was going to carry that choice for the rest of her life the way I carried Sibq, and she knew it, and there was nothing on this earth I could say to her about it, so I didn't try. That was the emotionally heavy thing, if you're keeping count of such things. It wasn't a battle. It was a fence in the dark and a woman's hand letting go of a smaller hand because holding on meant both of them caught, and choosing, and living with the choosing. I have never in my life met anyone braver than that woman, and the bravest thing she ever did was survive a decision most people would rather die than make. She'd run then, west and north off the reservation over the bad country that ate her feet, aiming, she wasn't sure for what. Mexico, maybe. There were Chiricahua in the Sierra Madre still, free ones, and if she could get south and across, she might find her people's people, the ones the army hadn't broken. That was the whole of her plan, and it was a bad plan, and she'd known it, and she'd done it anyway because the alternative was the list. She'd hidden in a wash near Bowie, seen the cattle loading, understood that a train was faster than feet, and that a stock car was a place a woman might not be looked for, and she'd climbed in among the steers in the dark before the load-up, half out of her mind with thirst, and pulled the straw over herself, and the Sonora bell had pulled out with her inside it, and she had lain there in the fouled straw doing her arithmetic, away and toward freedom and the list, until she'd worked out that this train was carrying her east, the exact direction of the fever country, and that every mile was taking her closer to the thing she'd cut her own heart out to escape. And she'd made a rope and put it over a beam. That was the why I couldn't answer. She wanted to know why I'd stopped her. And I understood by the second night that under her why was a harder question she was too proud to ask, which was, stopped me for what? To be caught instead? To be handed over slower? What is the mercy in keeping a dead woman breathing a few more days? I answered it on the third night. We were stopped at a water tank, a nothing place, just a tank and a shack and a Mexican tender who'd wave any train through, and we'd gone through the small death of the stop and come out the other side alive again. And in the settling quiet after, with the steers dozing and the desert enormous and starshot through the door gap, I finally said the thing. You asked me why, I said, in Spanish, slow, getting it wrong, not caring. That first night. She looked at me. I took out the book. I don't know why I showed it to her. I'd never shown it to anyone. But I opened it to the middle, to the 4 names spelled wrong, and I turned it so the starlight through the gap fell on the page, and I put my finger under those 4 names, one at a time, and I said, Sibq, you know it. Her whole body changed. Stillness of a different kind, the stillness of an animal that has just understood the thing across from it is a predator after all. Her hand moved toward the corner, toward where the rope had been, and I hated myself, but I made myself keep going. I was there, I said, scouting for the bluecoats. I didn't, and here my Spanish failed me entirely, and I had to say it in English and hope she caught the shape. I didn't do the killing, but I didn't stop it. There was a moment I could have. I was young, and I was afraid, and I told myself it wasn't my business, and I watched. And these 4, my finger on the wrong spelled names, these 4 I watched die, and I didn't lift a hand, and I have carried them in this book for 9 years so that I'd never be able to pretend I didn't. I closed the book. You asked me why I stopped you, I said. That's why, not because I'm good, I'm not good. I'm a man with a book full of people I let die because it wasn't my business. And I looked at you with that rope and I thought, my voice went then and I had to wait for it to come back. I thought not one more name, not while I've got 2 hands and a train under me and a chance. That's the whole of it. It's a selfish thing if you look at it right. I stopped you to save myself, so I wouldn't have to carry you too. The desert wind came through the gap. The steers shifted and settled. She was quiet for so long I thought I'd broken it, the fragile thing we'd built, thought I'd been a fool to show her the worst of me. I sat there in the dark with the book on my knee and the 4 wrong names heavy under the cover, and waited for the sound of the rope going up over the beam. It didn't come. Instead, after a long time, she moved, came out of her corner, which she had never once done, crossed the little open ground between us that she had spent 3 days refusing to cross, and sat down. Not close, but closer. Within a man's arm length, the exact distance her whole body had spent 3 days telling her was death. And she looked at the closed book on my knee, and she put out one finger, cut, dark, wrapped in my trade cloth, and she touched the cover, just touched it, the way you'd touch a grave. And she told me their names. Her people, the brother, the aunt, the 2 small ones at the fence. She said each name slow and clear and made me say it back and corrected me when I got the sound wrong, patient, over and over until I had them right, not the way Sibq was wrong in my book, but right, the way she meant them. And I understood what she was doing. She was giving me new names for the book, living ones. Names of people she was carrying too in her own book that had no pages, and she was trusting me to carry them beside my dead. And it was the most terrible gift anyone has ever handed me, and I took it, and I have them still. She did not give me her own name. I noticed, I didn't ask. A person is allowed to keep one thing. When she'd finished, when I could say all 4 names right, she sat back, and she looked out the door gap at the stars, and for a moment, one moment in the middle of everything, the fear went off her face entire, and what was underneath was just a young woman, worn through to the tree, looking at the same sky her people looked at from the free mountains in the south. "I will not use the rope," she said, in Spanish, quiet, like a vow or a receipt. "Not now." "Good," I said, my own voice not steady. "Get me off this train," she said, before the east, before the List country, get me south. "And I will owe you nothing because you will have paid your own debt, and we will be—" She searched for the word iguales, same. "Same," I said. And I meant to tell her that I would, that I had it worked out, that there was a place I knew, a grade south of Deming where the train slowed to a crawl on the climb, close enough to the border country that a person on foot and southbound had a chance, that I'd get her off there in the dark with my canteens and my spare boots and what money I had, and point her at Mexico, and that would be that. I meant to tell her the plan, such as it was, and let her sleep on a plan instead of a rope. I opened my mouth to tell her, and the train's whistle screamed, and the brakes went on hard, that shriek of steel that means an unscheduled stop, means trouble on the line ahead, and the whole car lurched and threw the steers into a bawling panic, and through the door gap up ahead where the tracks curved, I saw them. Lanterns, a cluster of lanterns, swinging, at a siding I hadn't known was there. And men, a lot of men. And in the lantern light, unmistakable, the flat-brimmed hats and the crossed belts, and closer, on a spur beside the water tank, a second train, short, an engine and 3 cars. The kind of short, purposeful train that isn't carrying cattle. The kind that carries a list. She saw at the same moment I did. I felt her go rigid beside me. And I understood, with the train screaming to a halt beneath us and the lanterns swinging closer, that the arithmetic had changed again, that away and toward had collapsed into here, that the thing she'd run from had somehow got out ahead of her on the rails, and that whatever plan I'd been about to say was worth exactly nothing now. The brakes bit, the Sonora bell shuddered to a stop beside the waiting lanterns. And a voice outside, an officer's voice, bored and certain, a voice that had done this many times, called out into the dark for every car to be opened and every car to be searched. I need to tell you about the next 4 minutes carefully, because they were the most important minutes of my life, and because I have spent 30 years making sure I remember them exactly as they were and not as the story would like them to be. The lanterns were coming down the line. I could hear the slat doors going back, 1 car at a time, and the officer's bored voice, and a soldier's answer, and the doors again. A machine of men working its way toward us, 3 cars off, then 2. She was already moving. Not toward the rope, she'd meant her vow, and she kept it. And I have loved a great many things about that woman, but I think I loved that most, that even here, even now, she reached for the living option first. She was up and at the far door, the one on the desert side, away from the lanterns, hauling at the latch, my good latch rope. The one she'd nearly used to die, holding the door shut, hauling it loose. "They'll see you," I said low, fast, at her shoulder. "The second you're down on the ground on that side, first man with a lantern who walks the length." "I run," she said. Not a plan. A fact. She would go out the desert door and she would run into the black country the way she'd run before, feet or no feet, and either the dark would take her or the men would, and she had decided which she preferred, and it was the dark. And she would not make it. I knew the country. It was open for a half-mile before it broke into anything a person could disappear into, and there was a moon coming up, and there were mounted men over there. I'd seen the horses at the siding. And a woman on cut feet running open ground under a moon against mounted men is not an escape. It is a slower way of being a name in a book. 1 car off now. I could hear the officer's voice clear. She got the latch loose, slid the door back a hand's width onto the black desert and the rising moon. Turned to me, 1 look, and in it a whole conversation we didn't have time for. "Thank you and goodbye, and this is where we are the same. This is where the debt is paid. Let me go and be clean," and she gathered herself to run. And I heard myself say the thing. I have wondered all my life where it came from. I am not a fast man. I am not a clever man. Every important moment of my life up to that one I had spent calculating, weighing the current, deciding it wasn't worth it, being right and hating myself. And here, with no time to calculate at all, out of some part of me I'd never met, the words came, and they were the truest words I ever said. "Don't run out there," I said. "Run to me instead." She stopped half in the door, the moon on her face. "What?" she said. English. The second English word she ever gave me. "They're searching the cars." I said, fast, low, the plan assembling itself even as I spoke it, out ahead of my own thinking. They'll find you in the desert. They won't find you in the herd. I grabbed the trade blanket off the straw and my hat, and I was already moving to the steers, to the big brindle and the others, 40 head of jostling, bawling, moonwild cattle. They open this door, they see a cowhand and his cows. They don't count cows. Nobody in the history of the world ever counted a cow. Get in the middle. Get down low under the blanket, hand on the brindle's flank, move when he moves. You're not a woman hiding in a car. You're the dark between two steers. You run to me, into the herd, into the mess, into the last place a man looks, and I'll stand in the door and I'll be so boring and so ordinary they'll be gone before they've finished yawning. She looked at the black desert and the free-seeming moon. She looked at the wall of stinking, panicking cattle and the man asking her to walk into them, into the thing that could crush her, into the dark and the danger and the trust. The door of the next car went back. One car, the officer's voice right there. Cattle, move on, no, open it, all of them, the man said open all of them. Run to me, I said again, not a command, a hand held out. You've run away your whole life, I'm asking you to run to something, just once, run to me. And she did. She came off that desert door and she crossed the car and she went into the herd, into the exact wall of animal flesh her every instinct screamed against, and I got her down low against the brindle's flank in the churning middle of them, the blanket over her, her wrapped hand in the coarse hair of the steer's side, and I banked straw, and I stood up, and I picked up my lantern, and I slid our door back myself from the inside, wide and easy and unafraid. 1 whole second before the soldier could do it for me. Evening, I said to the 2 men and the officer and the swinging lanterns. Bored, tired, a hired man at the end of a long haul. You'll want to stand back. Had one go down earlier, they're all spooked, and a spooked steer'll void on your boots quick as look at you. The officer put his lantern up. It swept the car, 40 pairs of dull, wet eyes. The stink rolled out at him, hot and thick, and he flinched from it the way every clean-handed man flinches, and his light passed over the churning backs of the cattle, over the straw, over the big brindle steer standing in the middle with something dark and low pressed to its off flank in the shadow the lantern couldn't reach, because a lantern only lights what it points at, and he was not going to point it under half a ton of nervous beef. How many head? The officer said. 40, I said. You want to count 'em, I'll hold the light. Fair warning, they kick. And that was it. That was the whole of it. He did not want to count them. Nobody in the history of the world ever counted a cow. He held his lantern a moment longer, and I stood in the door being the most boring man in the territory, and behind me in the dark a woman lay pressed to a steer's flank with her heart going like the train's own wheels, and the officer said, "Close it up," and turned away and called to the next car, and the machine of men moved on. I closed the door. I did not close it all the way. I left the desert side latch loose, the way she'd left it. We waited, God, we waited. The search went to the end of the train and doubled back, and I heard the short train on the spur getting up its steam, and voices, and after a long time, the longest time of my life, the Sonora bell blew its whistle, and the coupling slammed tight down the length of her, and we lurched, and rolled, and pulled away from the siding and the lanterns and the short train that carried the list, out into the dark, southbound, climbing. I got her up out of the herd. She was shaking. So was I. We didn't speak. There wasn't anything to say that our 2 sets of shaking hands weren't already saying. The grade came an hour on. South of Deming, the long, slow climb where I'd always known the train crawled near to a walking pace, close enough to the border country that a person on foot and southbound had a chance. I'd known it before I ever met her. I think, if I'm honest, I'd known it that first night, sitting on my heels with my hat in my hands, known there was a place I could get her off, and that I would. I filled both canteens. I gave her my spare boots, which were too big, and she stuffed the toes with trade cloth and laced them tight over her ruined feet without a word. I gave her the money I had, which wasn't much, folded small. I pointed her south and told her what I knew of the country, the water that could be trusted and the water that couldn't, the low pass through the hills that would keep her off the roads, the fact that the free Chiricahua in the Sierra Madre were real and were south, and were, as far as any man knew, still free. She listened. She took it all, and when the train had slowed to its crawl on the steepest of the grade, in the last of the dark before the moon set, she stood in the desert side door with the loose latch, ready to go. She turned back to me, one more time, the way she had before. And she gave me her name. I had not asked. I had decided long since I never would. But she gave it to me anyway, quiet, clear, the way she'd given me the other 4 names by the water tank, said it once, made me say it back, corrected the sound, patient until I had it right. Her own name. The one thing she'd kept. She handed it to me in the dark on a slowing train, the last thing she owned that hadn't been taken, and she gave it to me to keep. I am not going to write it here. I have carried it 30 years, and it is the one name I have never spoken aloud and never spelled and never will, because it is not a name for a book of the failed and the dead. It is a living name, the name of a woman who ran to me instead of into the dark, and I keep it apart, in the place where a man keeps the thing that saved him, and I do not spend it, and I never will. She stepped down onto the running board. The desert went by slow beneath us, close enough now to touch. She looked at me once more, and there was, I will swear to this on anything you like, there was almost the beginning of the laugh in her face, the one I'd wanted, the one I never got to see finished. Almost. And then she stepped off, light into the moving dark, and hit the ground running the way she'd run her whole life. Only this once running toward something, southbound, toward the free mountains, and the desert took her. Not the way I'd feared it would take her. The other way. The way that means hidden, means gone from the men with lanterns, means maybe. I stood in the door and watched the place where she'd been until the grade crested, and the train picked up speed, and there was nothing back there but dark and the setting moon. I never learned if she made it. That's the part people don't like when I tell it. They want the end. They want to know, did she reach the Sierra Madre? Did she find her people's people? Is there an old woman somewhere in the free mountains who lived a long life and told her grandchildren about a fool cowhand who worried about his latch rope? I don't know. I couldn't know. A person who successfully disappears is, by definition, a person you never hear from again, and the whole of what I gave her was the chance to disappear. And if she used it well, then I was never going to learn a thing, and the not learning is the proof. The not learning is the hope, and I have made my peace with an answer that is also a question and always will be. I did one thing after that I want to tell you. That night in the empty caboose with the Sonora Belle running south and my hands finally still, I took out the book. The book of the names of the failed and the dead. 14 names and the 4 from Sci-Fi spelled wrong. I turned past all of them to the first clean page at the back. And I did not write her name. I told you I never would. But I wrote the 4 names she'd given me by the water tank. The brother, the aunt, the 2 small ones from the fence wrote them right, the way she'd taught me, the living way. And under them I left a space. A whole clean page empty waiting. Because those 4 might be alive somewhere in the east in the List country and might get free someday and might need carrying by someone who'd remember them right, and I was going to be that someone, and the page was theirs, and I was keeping it open on purpose. A book of the dead with a page kept open for the living. That's the thing she gave me. She took a man who cataloged his failures and she made him, for the first time in his life, keep a page for a maybe. I have carried it 30 years.